Good morning and welcome to WITA. We're going to get started in just a moment when everyone's had a chance to log into our Zoom room. Good morning and welcome to WITA. We are delighted to welcome you all here today. Before we jump into today's topic, we have a really big event coming up. On Wednesday, April 12th, we are honored to be hosting Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, at an in-person event at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. That event will also be live streamed for those of you who cannot join us in person. As part of that event, prior to Dr. Ngozi's remarks, we'll have a panel discussion to discuss the role of the WTO in a net zero future. WTO Deputy Director General Angela Ellard, among others, will be joining us for that discussion. Information on that event is linked in the chat and can be found at www.wita.org. Today is almost 3 years to the day of our very first webinar, which was on March 26, 2020. And if you've watched any of the 180 webinar panels we've done since that auspicious debut, you know we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with today, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Cleet Willems at Aiken Gump, Abe Friedman with the Office of Congresswoman Suzanne DelBene, Maureen Grew at the Department of Treasury, Elke Clapper with the EU delegation in Washington, and Alexandra Whitaker, with the House Ways and Means Committee. Welcome Cleet, Abe, Maureen, Elke, and Alexandra, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab. You should have also received a copy of today's event program and biographies of our speakers by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. We actually started planning today's event before we knew a trade negotiation might be launched between the US and EU. But the big question we had then and now is, how do you negotiate an agreement that meets the objectives of Congress in drafting the Inflation Reduction Act? We have a fantastic panel assembled and each bring a different perspective to the conversation. Professor Kathleen Claussen of Georgetown Law has written extensively about the legal issues surrounding trade deals and particularly the Congressional executive relationship. She's written several articles about trade executive agreements and worked closely with lawmakers to address these issues. In fact, a paper she published in 2021 about trade mini deals helped inspire the title for today's event. We'll share that in the chat today and some of the other blog posts that she's written on our event webpage. Cathy Koch is the lead at Ernst & Young on global tax policy and sustainability. Prior to joining EY, Cathy served as chief policy advisor to Majority Leader Harry Reid for tax and economics. And prior to that, she was staff director for the Senate Finance Subcommittee on Energy, Natural Resources and Infrastructure, and served as the chief tax policy staffer on the full committee. Kellyanne Shaw is a partner at Hogan and Lovells and a former deputy assistant to the president for international economic affairs and deputy director of the National Economic Council, and before that, a trade council in the House Ways and Means Committee. And our moderator, Peter Rashish, Vice President and Director, the Geoeconomics program at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Peter has been writing for months about the contentious issues at the heart of the IRA bill that the trade negotiation is meant to address, and how to rethink what we mean when we discuss trade agreements. Peter?
Well, thank you very much, Ken, and let me add my welcome to all of you today. Before I hand over the virtual floor to the speakers, let me offer a very brief scene setter on our topic today of the US-EU mini deal on critical minerals. I think there are three aspects of this worth mentioning. We've seen a general warming of the transatlantic economic relationship, an increased concern to make trade and climate policies work together, and then we've seen some stepped up domestic efforts on decarbonization on both sides. As far as EU-US relations are concerned, we saw the launch of the Trade and Technology Council in 2021, at a very high level. The aim there is to promote shared values in trade, set standards for secure and resilient and sustainable supply chains. This is motivated partly by China, but also topic that's part of our discussion today, to fight climate change. And on that, more directly, the US and EU are also separately engaged in bilateral negotiations toward a deal on green and fairly traded steel and aluminum that stems from the Biden administration's decision to lift the Trump administration's own Section 232 national security tariffs on the EU. And these negotiations are supposed to wrap up in the fall. And finally, more directly on our topic today, there's the US and the EU have taken significant actions domestically recently. On the US side, there was a reliance on sticks, on regulation to combat change, but with the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, there's a big bet now on carrots, on the subsidies to decarbonize. And as part of this, there are $370 billion worth of consumer tax credits for the purchase of electric vehicles, but to qualify, the critical minerals have to come from either the US or countries in which US has a free trade agreement. So the deal that the US and the EU are aiming for, that we're discussing today, is part of this. And finally, on the EU side, the EU have been taking a price-based approach to fighting climate change with the emissions trading system they established about 20 years ago. Now they've introduced this year a carbon border adjustment mechanism that will tax carbon-intensive imports out of concern to level the playing field for EU producers. But what we've seen since the introduction of the IRA, maybe in a sort of case of if you can't beat them, join them, is that the EU has now decided to adopt some of the US approach with what it's calling its European Green Industrial Plan. Now that has some improved conditions for climate investments and also for access to raw materials, but it's also trying to increase the amount of funding available for companies and consumers through reforms to the EU subsidy policies, and eventually even something they're calling an EU sovereignty fund. So that's kind of what we're seeing in the transatlantic space, I think, around these issues. And with that, that's probably all from me for the moment, and I'll hand it over to Cathy to start.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ken, and everyone. Yeah, I'm going to set the stage a little for how the U.S. has been approaching green and renewable energy for a while. You know, we've been using, we are heavy on credits, the carrots rather, when it comes to green energy and renewable energy. And this probably started way before, but in my world, it started in 2005 with the Energy Policy Act. In 2005, we made some of the first credits, production tax credits, credits for renewable energy, for biofuels, for biodiesel. This all came together. Total spending was about $3.8 billion over 10 years in the Energy Policy Act, and a lot of the incentives were temporary, as many of them still are, although we did fix that a bit in the IRA. In the US, so we got past the Energy Policy Act, and a lot of the temporary provisions, expired just 5 years later. So by the time we got to ARA, which was the 2009 Rescue Act, we were already seeking renewals of provisions for wind, for solar, for all of these renewable energy technologies. ARA was one of, the White House described it as one of the largest investments in clean energy in history. At the time, it was $90 billion in strategic clean energy investments and provisions to leverage over $150 billion in private and non-federal funds for investments in clean energy technology. So that's when kind of my job really took off, was with ARA and how we pushed forward all the clean energy policy provisions that were developed maybe initially in 2005. So this has been going on. We've been giving a lot of carrots for this stuff, a lot of incentives. On the other hand, Europe, as Peter alluded, they've been working in a kind of a price carbon world. And, they have a very successful ETS, very long-standing ETS. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, as Peter described, is an effort to equilibrate the burden on imports of the existing ETS. Ultimately, I think all economies that are pricing are probably going to consider a carbon border adjustment mechanism. We'll see what happens with the EU CBAM. It's very interesting, but it is a unique blend of tax and trade policy, and it's more of a stick. Now, let's go back to the US. Recently, we had the US IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act devoted about $370 billion to clean energy. And of a lot of these, they were transportation focused. Why? Because transportation is responsible for 27%, excuse me, of emissions in the US. So this is a big, you can electrify the transportation sector, you can do a lot to reduce emissions. And we, just like every other country, we go to the COP, the UN climate conferences, we make a lot of pledges. Every country does. We have about 180 signatories to the Glasgow COP, 200 signatories to the Sharm el-Sheikh COP that just finished in December. They come home and they make policies to fulfill these pledges and drive technologies forward. In the US, we've got the IRA. The IRA put about $50 billion towards production tax credits, investment credits, and other credits that involve EV technology and battery technology. And many of those credits, do have restrictions for geography of manufacture or geography of mining. Some of the bigger ones are the clean vehicle credit under 30C. Like if you're a tax person, with a 30C credit. It's $7.5 billion, and it specifies that critical minerals must be extracted or processed in North America. We have similar credits for previously owned clean vehicles, for commercially owned vehicles, or for commercial use vehicles, for heavy duty vehicles. But then we also have a couple other provisions for growing the domestic supply chain. There's an advanced technology vehicle manufacturing loan program, $3 billion, loans to manufacturing clean vehicles and their components made in the US, not just North America, but in the US. The domestic manufacturing conversion grants, $2 billion, cost share grants for domestic production of hybrids, electric vehicles, et cetera. And then finally, 45X, advanced manufacturing production credit. Everyone in tax loves a production tax credit, $30 billion. This is really significant, but it's a tax credit for domestic manufacturing of components along the supply chain, battery cells and modules, and critical minerals processing. This is causing a stir, as you can imagine, because it focuses on domestic or North American production and sourcing. When we were at the COP in Egypt this year, President Biden appeared, as well as President Macron, and they kind of had a little talk. It was in the press. I think it might have been in front of a mic about, hey, the IRA is upsetting a lot of the European countries because the IRA represents a lot of incentives for processing in the US. So that a multinational company has a lot of choices in location. President Biden said, don't worry, we're going to work this out. And then it was very interesting because on February 1st, it seemed to be worked out, as Peter said. We didn't go the way of the WTO or more complaints, but we kind of, if you can't beat them, join them. And the EU Industrial Green Deal, I think, is very interesting. One of the biggest sentences in the EU press release, or the EU material on it, the Green Industrial Plan, the Green Deal Industrial Plan aims to simplify, accelerate, and align incentives to preserve the competitiveness and attractiveness of the EU as an investment location. And this is, kind of what it's about now. The EU Industrial Green Deal is yet to be specified, but we were expecting some proposals out just this week, March 14th. I didn't see any big press, so I guess I'm caught up. The EU has, a lot of parties to agree on, but that is developing, and I think it's a kind of a nice solution. But it is, it is kind of it didn't go the way I expected, but I think that it does establish a form of cooperation on these things. There must have been a conversation. If you look at the EU Green Deal announcements, it looks almost like they were reading the IRA when they did it. So we'll see what happens then. My co-presenters here are going to know a lot more about the trade aspects of this. But I would say, as we kind of deal with what happened with the EU Industrial Green Deal, response to the IRA, we should think ahead about the future. And when is everyone going to run out of budget for these kind of incentives? This approach is a very expensive approach. I'm all for it, but it does, beg the question of what happens when budgets get tight. After COVID, we do have budget tightening all over the world. And then do we turn more to pricing? And then we have kind of the flip side of this problem. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter to take it away.
Thanks, Cathy. And now I turn to you, Kathleen.
Great. Thanks so much, Peter, and thanks to the WITA team for the invitation. So I'm going to transition us then from Cathy's helpful opening of what's happening on both sides of the Atlantic to some of the legal issues surrounding the EU-US deal that's being negotiated in response to the language of the IRA. So you heard from Cathy that both sides have their own approaches to dealing with this issue and these issues more broadly. But zeroing in on the language of the IRA, where, to remind everybody of what Peter said at the outset, that there's this critical mineral requirement that has to be met for the producers of the vehicles to benefit from the critical mineral tax credit that Cathy mentioned. They have to demonstrate that there's they've met a threshold percentage with respect to the value of the critical minerals in the vehicle's battery that were extracted or processed in the United States, or, and here's the key language, in any country with which the United States has a free trade agreement in effect. All right, so when that language came out, many of our allies get concerned because we don't have a big FTA, at least in the way we usually think of that term, with the EU or with Japan. So that's how we got here to talk about this critical minerals deal, this mini deal, as the title of our event suggests. Now, what followed the legislation was that, and many of you will know, the Treasury put out a white paper on December 29th that sort of explained what it's expecting to propose a free trade agreement might mean in response to, again, these concerns from allies, that it's not just going to mean the big FTAs that we have with 20 countries, but we might think of including other sorts of agreements. And it lists different criteria as to what types of agreements it might include, such as an agreement that reduces or eliminates trade barriers on a preferential basis, or even an agreement that commits the parties to refrain from imposing new barriers, et cetera, et cetera. We don't need to go through it. Okay, so Treasury's in a tough spot. And I'm sympathetic to where Treasury finds itself because it's trying to accommodate our friends who are not comprehensive FTA partners. But I think what I'll argue here in the next few minutes is that it's made it tougher for itself by taking a path that maybe is the path of more resistance, as I outlined in some of my recent writing that I know Ken said he will share. So this EU-US critical minerals specific deal was rumored and then confirmed by the administration. Same with Japan, which we could talk about separately if folks wish. I assume we'll hear more about this at the hearings with Ambassador Tai in Congress over the next 2 days. This was discussed also in the European Parliament on Monday in Brussels here. And so I think everyone's hoping, at least the two sides are hoping for a happy marriage. And so with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue, very marriage specific. And what's old is going to be this concern about these trade executive agreements, these mini deals that we've had for many years, but would have been a topic of concern for a long time. The new part is this IRA language and trying to squeeze something into it. The borrowed part is going to be this reasoning that has been used by the executive in the past to justify these sorts of mini deals. And the blue part, I think, is going to be a lot of folks on the Hill and folks, maybe some of our trading partners and auto companies that think they're disadvantaged by what results. Okay, so if you're Treasury and you see this language, you have to start by asking, of course, what can you do with it? So it says FTA. We know that FTA is not a defined term in US law. So if you're Treasury, you say, we can interpret it as we wish. Fine. What's the universe of options then for Treasury? We've got many different types of trade agreements, so we just need to figure out which ones count as free and which ones are not. And they could include so many different types within that. They might include the WTO, which we can talk about more in the Q&A. But we actually have, as I've written and Ken referred to kindly at the start, more than 1,200 different trade deals with over 100 different countries. So it seemed like they might actually consider this broad definition of trade deals when they wrote that guidance paper on December 29th. Trade agreements, that term is across US law, but what makes them free could be defined along different dimensions, including to encompass any combination of really these 1,200 mini deals that exist in US law. It'd be pretty tricky to draw the line and say, well, these mini deals count, these mini deals don't. But among those 1,200, you could presumably draw the line somehow. And just to give a sense of what I'm talking about, we've got mini deals like we might count here the Japan deal of a few years ago. We can count here some of the side agreements that we've got on specific issues like poultry. There's a long list. Again, we could talk about that more if folks wish. A little hiccup in this plan, if you did want to rely on these 1,200 deals, is that the executive branch has been purposefully setting them apart from the ones that we have, these comprehensive deals, for the last 40 years. So reversing course and now saying, okay, those are actually the same. May feel to some to be maybe a little arbitrary, maybe a little capricious, but again, it could be done. And I should add that, of course, among those major FTAs that we have, they don't even have FTA in the title in some instances, right? Some of them are called trade promotion agreements. So there's a lot of wiggle room in sort of what we have. We just use FTA as shorthand. And maybe the last sort of footnote to this approach would be that some of those agreements we might doubt were ever authorized by Congress in the first place, but okay, let's say we're all willing to move past that, so be it, we have them. All right, so far we could say Treasury has its pick of countries if it uses any combination of these other trade agreements that we have in place. It might take some somersaults to sort of define these are the ones that will count as free and these are the rest, but it could probably make it work. Now we have a different problem, however. The second problem, or bigger problem, I think, in which we find ourselves is that Treasury has said it's actually going to conclude new agreements to try and understand this language. So it's interpreting free trade agreements now to include additional agreements, this EU-US mini deal, and others that it might now negotiate in the next several weeks. Now, why is this a problem? Well, first of all, Treasury does not have any authority to negotiate trade agreements. It does not have legal authority under US law to negotiate trade agreements. So you might say, well, USTR does. Let's just have USTR go quickly negotiate some trade agreements. We'll call those free trade agreements. Well, that would be fine if Congress had delegated authority to USTR to do that, but it hasn't. The executive branch, including USTR, does not have any inherent authority to regulate commerce. So in the absence of delegated authority from Congress, it can't negotiate trade deals. Now, you could split hairs, and I've heard this argument before. Some people say, well, it can negotiate whatever it wants, but it can't enter into any trade deals that it negotiates. Okay, well, at the end of the day, the result is the same, and nothing about the IRA creates that floor. What appears to be happening is that Treasury is relying on USTR's what we call organic statute. That's the foundational statute that says the mandate of what USTR does generally as an agency. And if you want to look it up, you can Google 19 USC 2171. That's what USTR cites all the time as its authority to negotiate trade deals without congressional approval, including, for example, IPEF. That's what it's relying on for doing IPEF. And this is what members of Congress have been saying for several years is insufficient. You can pull up the statute yourself, take a look. I tend to agree the argument's pretty weak to rely on that as a basis for being able to enter into trade deals. So where does this leave us? Well, no doubt, Treasury and USTR are going to do these deals. They're nearly done. Congress not happy either procedurally or substantively. I don't have time in my opening remarks here to talk about the substance of the deal, but that's an interesting conversation in itself. What's in it for the US, we might ask? How can this narrow tax credit be used to achieve what maybe something like IPEF light if we get into the substance? But okay, Congress is unhappy. What can Congress do? Let's start with the legislative options. Congress could legislate to provide authority to do what's already happening now. It could provide legislation that would signal some sort of approval of the deal that's being negotiated now. But it could also legislate in the opposite direction. It could intervene to say, we're going to take away authority that someone presumed to have had, or to clarify the terms of the law and limit the scope of what it meant by FTA and move forward with that. Legislation is difficult, as we all know. This is an audience that knows that better than most. So we might expect a non-legislative path to be the way forward. The executive could, at the very least, engage with Congress in a very close way to find a solution that works for both sides. This happens all the time behind the scenes. Again, this audience knows. And I think that that most reasonable non-legislative path is probably what's going to happen, even if it's a challenge and even if members of Congress would prefer something more. And there's a bigger, much longer effort ongoing to deal with these trade executive agreements like IPEF, to facilitate congressional involvement, make them constitutionally sound, to draw a line between what Congress is willing to let the executive do on its own versus not. But that's, again, a much bigger project. And unlike with IPEF, where you have a lot of congressional support to actually get it done, IRA has really teed it up in a more divisive way, I think, unfortunately, and that could have been avoided. Very last thing I'll say is, let's say this all moves ahead. I think we can agree that it probably will. We get these deals with the EU and with Japan. And what happens next then? So, well, frankly, it's not difficult to see a way to the courthouse. Frankly, no matter what happens, that's likely to occur. All roads lead to the US courts. And it's not difficult to construct about 15 different legal arguments about where Treasury has or could run afoul of the Administrative Procedure Act. I've only mentioned a few from what could be a longer list. So whatever Treasury does now, the litigation risk seems very high, and we'll have to wait and see what happens. So in sum, one, Treasury could have worked this out within the universe of existing agreements. Two, stepping outside of that brings us back to this IPEF and longstanding problem that there's no negotiating authority. This could have been a platform to maybe deal with that, advance a sort of TPA light for a new way forward for congressional executive trade relations, but it's not. And third, assuming that Congress is not going to take away authority or otherwise intervene behind the scenes, the more likely, and I think the more impactful space for grievances is going to be US courts. Peter, back to you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Kellyanne, over to you.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you to WITA and my fellow panelists. I have to say it's quite exciting to be back on a panel talking about FTA negotiations after a bit of a hiatus, regardless of what you think of the substance of these particular deals. But, you know, I'll just share a couple of words from my perspective. You know, I spent 10 years in government working for USTR, Congress, and the White House. And I often joke that in each of those roles, I was convinced that I ran trade policy. And so, you know, where you stand on some of these constitutional issues really does depend on where you sit. And now that I know I do not run trade policy, being in the private sector, I spend a lot of time trying to be as objective as possible in advising those who are engaged in the actual trading under a lot of our trade, free trade rules. So just with that, you know, I guess the punchline of this all is it is very hard to evaluate these deals in concept without actually seeing the final text of what has been negotiated. So that is effectively my punchline, but I've got a lot of other interesting stuff to say in between now and getting to that. So starting just with a couple of stories that I think will provide some context, and largely based on my experience working in the government and working out a lot of these differences between Article 1 and Article 2, and how Congress and the executive interact and partner on trade. You know, I started on the Hill in 2016, and as everyone recalls, that was a time when trade became hot again. Both presidential candidates were talking a lot about it. President Trump was elected and threatened to tear up NAFTA, the Chorus Agreement, and make some other pretty radical changes. So at the time, as you can imagine, I spent my free time looking at old pieces of legislation, legislative history, trying to get a handle on, you know, to what extent had Congress actually delegated its Article 1 authority to the executive. And one of sort of the treasures that I stumbled across in the Ways and Means library was the old hearing transcript from the Trade Act of 1934. And for those who may not follow trade policy in the way that some of us on this panel do, it was called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. And what this act did was, for the first time in history, Congress delegated to the executive in the aftermath of the Great Depression, World War I, Smoot-Hawley, the authority to go forth and enter into and negotiate trade deals, reciprocal trade deals with trading partners, which involved a whole host of tariff and non-tariff barriers, and to unilaterally enter into that deal and at will terminate that deal. Now, this was hotly debated in Congress at the time, having a lot of the same debates that we're having today. And if you read the hearing transcript, one of the most interesting exchanges is between ranking member Alan Treadway from Massachusetts. He was the Republican, who voted against this, saying that it would surrender the taxing power to the president and his subordinates in violation of both the letter and spirit of the Constitution. And there is this really powerful exchange between Treadway and Cordell, who was the Secretary of State at the time for President Roosevelt, who was before Congress defending this request for power, where Treadway is demanding, is this constitutional? You are asking us to delegate this mass authority over to the executive with no oversight. How can this be constitutional? And Hull just avoids the question. He continues to say things like, there are hundreds of millions of people dying right now. Our children are dying. People are starving. Why are you asking about the constitutionality of this? And Treadway continues to go back with the same question, and Hull continues to avoid it by talking about broader national security and humanitarian issues. And ultimately, this legislation passes 247 to 111 in the House, passes the Senate, goes to the president, and is signed into law. That authority, which was renewed every 3 years because it was viewed as emergency powers, so not sort of this blank check forever, but every 3 years Congress would check back in with it, was sent to a largely Democratic Senate and House for the next several decades. And it was renewed without question about its constitutionality again. And to sort of put the cherry on top, it was exempted from judicial review. So courts never actually opined on whether or not this was constitutional. But this served as the basis for the modern trading system as we know it. These concepts of reciprocity, non-discrimination, these principles served as the basis for the negotiation of the GATT, and which eventually became the WTO. But if you asked me from a very objective perspective, was any of this constitutional? I think that there's a good argument to suggest it may not have been. But nevertheless, that is the modern trading system as we know it, and it became the foundation for fast track and all of our other large comprehensive trade deals. So I'll get to my point very quickly again, but just one other quick story from modern times. In 2018, the president renegotiated the Chorus Agreement. He threatened to tear up the whole thing. Congress did not like that approach. The Koreans also did not like that approach, but ultimately agreed to an amendment to that agreement, which included provisions on steel, autos, and pharmaceuticals, as well as some other bells and whistles. But I remember those conversations with the administration where they showed us the text, and this was not something that went back to Congress for a vote. This was something the administration did unilaterally. And among the changes to the agreement, most of which were changes agreed to by Korea, were commitments by the United States to amend the rules of origin. Now, if you follow these issues closely, you would understand that changes to the rules of origin, much like changes to tariff rates, would take legislation. So we looked at the administration, they looked at us, we said, what's your authority for doing it? They looked at us. And at the end of the day, nobody said anything publicly about it, and Congress effectively acquiesced to the deal. And what was the reason? Congress liked the substance. They liked what was negotiated. And the thought of having to go to battle with the administration over constitutional priorities in a pretty public way could have led to the disruption of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of bilateral trade. So what's my point with all of this? My point is these constitutional issues are real. These questions are real. But in almost every situation, they get resolved politically through conversation between the executive branch and Congress. And most of these conversations happen behind closed doors. So when we're looking at the IRA, and I think that this is a really interesting piece of legislation, and we're talking specifically about this critical minerals provision, which Kathleen articulated, requires that for purposes of the consumer tax credit. So this is 30D. This is the $7,500 of money that you as the consumer, if you meet certain criteria, can get back if you purchase an electric vehicle. Half of that tax credit, so $3,750 of it, require that the EV battery be composed of minerals which are extracted or processed in any country with which the United States has a free trade agreement in effect or recycled in North America. The other half of that credit, so the other $3,750, requires that the value of the EV battery components be manufactured in North America in accordance with the sort of a sliding threshold, much like the way the critical mineral credit works. But the other piece that is overlaying both of these is a prohibition on any of the components or critical minerals being sourced from a foreign entity of concern, for which China is specifically listed. So, what would I do if I were in the administration shoes interpreting this language? As Kathleen said, this language is not necessarily clear as drafted. There is no statutory definition of a free trade agreement. We tend to assume that it is the 20 trading partners that are party to our comprehensive FTAs. But that is not the entire universe with which the administration is limited in terms of the way they interpret this provision. Now, that may not have been what Congress meant. Congress may have had a more specific definition in mind, but the administration is interpreting the text as drafted. So if I were a Democratic political appointee serving in the Biden administration who wanted to give effect to the IRA, what would I have done? I think as a first step, I would have said that the WTO, the covered agreements, count as a free trade agreement. I've been a trade lawyer for a long time, and it is very hard for anyone to argue that they are not an FTA. As a matter of fact, we have legislation, the Uruguay Rounds Agreement Act, which was approved by Congress, much like our other comprehensive FTAs, which everyone sort of suggests and assumes are what we mean when we use that phrase. The way that we sort of get China out from this picture, right, because China is a WTO member, is to rely on the foreign entity of concern provision. So any WTO country can be a country of source, except for any foreign entities of concern. So that sort of takes care of that problem. For whatever reason, the administration did not use this. The approach they used would not have been my first choice, but it probably is pretty close to my second or third choice in the way that I would have interpreted this. I think another way to do it was suggested by Kathleen as well, is to take agreements like the Japan phase 1 deal that we negotiated, potentially notifying that to the WTO as an interim agreement under provisions in the GATT, which would give a bit more cover. It kind of looks and walks and quacks like an FTA in some sense. So it's a little bit closer to that line. Again, they chose not to do it. But if you are just looking at the plain text of this and what is a free trade agreement country in the context of the IRA, certainly negotiating a critical mineral specific free trade agreement seems like a reasonable way forward. Now that said, and I know I'm like way over time at this point, I completely understand why you have members like Senator Wyden and Crapo who are expressing concern about this, right? They are Congress and they have to express concern about this. They need to protect their constitutional prerogatives and priorities. They cannot just let the administration walk out there, negotiate anything as an FTA and call it a done deal and claim to have authority, right? It doesn't work that way. Again, this is going to be a political discussion that happens between the two branches to sort of work out the contours of what can and cannot fall into that context. But there is a difference between complaining about something and doing something about it. And again, if I'm a betting woman, I'm going to guess that ultimately this is going to get worked out in conversations between the two branches. But ultimately, we don't know till we see the substance. And if I learned anything from my time working on the Hill, it's that ultimately the substance is going to drive a lot of this. And if the Biden administration negotiates something that Congress likes, it's going to go a lot more smoothly for the administration in terms of resolving those issues. But it's a little too soon to opine on the contents of it. I will just say two more things before handing it back over to Peter. I agree it's a little strange that Treasury is negotiating this and not USTR. Certainly, I think it's fair to raise questions about that. But ultimately, we'll see where we get to on the substance. This is something, it's a high priority for Congress and the administration. They want to see this law go into effect and really be used by companies. And if you don't expand the universe of countries that qualify as FTA countries as the statute is written, it's going to be very hard for any company to meet these thresholds. So I'll just pause there.
Kellyanne, thank you very much. Let me start with a kind of definitional question. How much looking at all of you, how much any of you think that when you're talking about the term free trade agreement, that the inclusion of new market access commitments, tariff reductions is essential for something to be called a free trade agreement? Is it a deal breaker if there's no new market access? Who'd like to dare jumping in on that one?
I could start, although Kellyanne, maybe you also wish to come in on this. So I think, Peter, as well, let me go back and respond to a couple of things that Kellyanne said, because not surprisingly to me, she and I are on very much the same page for a great deal of what we said. That is that this has been a bipartisan issue for a long time, I think, is one thing that we both think. And secondly, that the solution will be political ultimately, given many other challenges in the picture right now. And then, as you heard, I think we disagree a little bit about what's the first choice option versus the second, and perhaps in ways that maybe surprised ourselves. But in any event, I think on your question, Peter, which tees off of where Kellyanne and I agree, is that it doesn't really matter. I think we both say, but Kellyanne, you tell me, that what the actual details of the content would be for the words that we're talking about here, right? It's more about, this is a question of how Treasury is going to try to fit certain things into those words, right? And so that market access, that doesn't seem like it's on the table right now, and that's not really what we're talking about in that sense that I think you mean those words. And would be consistent with what we've seen from the administration otherwise. And this, in a way, it's market access specific to critical minerals, right? But it's not a broad-based market access agreement like people have seen in the past and that normally they think about. Very last thing is just to talk about the WTO agreements that Kellyanne mentioned. The reason I probably disagree a little bit with Kellyanne on that is because in the WTO agreements case, in statute, Congress has treated them apart from other sorts of trade agreements and actually calls them out separately. And so I thought Treasury would be on a weaker basis to rely on WTO as its foundational meaning of FTA here than it could from some other agreements. So that's my only quick thought on that, Kellyanne, but let me pass to you.
Sure. So just in terms of the question about tariffs, no, I don't think tariffs need to be included for something to be considered a free trade deal or a trade deal. There are lots of policies and non-tariff barriers that impact U.S. trade relations pretty dramatically. And so I think that Congress actually has a pretty good claim to care about things other than tariffs as well. But, that said, I think that part of the conflict between Congress and the administration on this issue right now is broader frustration that the administration is not negotiating any tariffs on IPEF with the UK, any other governments, because they're still seen as a very important tool for U.S. commerce, business, and workers. So from that perspective, I understand that the conflict is certainly broader than just the critical mineral deals at hand, although that is certainly the topic du jour.
If there is some flexibility in terms of in terms of the definition of agreement that that would pass the test, and we see that the administration is negotiating some kinds of deals. You mentioned IPEF, but it will also, there is the Trade and Technology Council between the US and the EU. Why, in terms of steps the administration could have taken, or why, for example, is there anything that would hold back the administration to say that we've already accomplished some things in the Trade and Technology Council, and so whether it's on supply chains or artificial intelligence, and we expect to accomplish more, and we think, and why not sort of fold the critical minerals agreement into the TTC and say, for us that qualifies. Is there a way to look at IPEF or TTC, given the flexibility I think I hear from you, to look at that as qualifying as a free trade agreement? Or is that stretching it? Anyone?
Kellyanne, you want to start?
Start with the tough questions. Look, clearly there is going to be a limit as to what can be considered a free trade agreement. What that limit is the question that is being tested at this moment and is part of this debate. Whether you have some, handshake agreement in the context of a broader non-binding forum in which the US and EU are discussing other sort of advanced economy issues, may seem less the type of agreement than something that is a standalone critical mineral specific free trade agreement. That is my spidey sense. I mean, there's no sort of, black and white here, but I think the approach the administration is taking is much closer to the intent of Congress than, start standing at another working group in the context of the TTC, which I don't think would qualify.
Got it.
Yeah, I think likewise, Peter, from my side, and then Cathy, if you want to come in as well, look like you were, that it doesn't matter when we did this or under what umbrella, right? I think as Kellyanne's saying, we could have done this, they could have negotiated something 3 weeks ago before, or 3 months ago before this all sort of came out, or they could do this now. It doesn't matter so much. I would just want to say that I think the EU, the commissioner said on Monday when he was speaking to the European Parliament Trade Committee, he was very careful in his language, or the talking point was very carefully crafted. And it was, he said that they're negotiating FTA equivalent treatment. Now, I'll let folks sort of ruminate on that a little bit more, but FTA equivalent treatment, the EU, being more WTO cautious, right, itself is not going to call this an FTA. It is concerned about, I assume, about Article 24 of the GATT. And that was my understanding about why he was saying that. But others may feel differently. In any event, Peter, I think that from the EU perspective, they don't want this to be able to call this an FTA in the EU context for whatever reason. Hence, FTA equivalent treatment.
Got it.
Yeah, and all this is very complicated because of politics, right? Especially politics underlying the IRA in particular, which stem from politics, way back to Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But the thing is that, U.S. Congress is specifically focused on jobs in their states, in their districts. And to get this passed, I read a lot about, that original language, which was, kind of tight. And then I think, subsequent guidance from the Treasury, loosened it up a little. But that's how you get the votes. And especially in this Congress, I worry about the impact of, how easy is it going to be to get everyone to get the same, get everyone on board for something that seems like it's cooperating with the EU at the expense of limitation to North America, limitation to the US, which are really important concepts, especially if you didn't like the bill to begin with. And I think, so there's not only trade law to overcome here or to work with here, but there's also local politics and as well as partisan politics at play. I think it's going to be very difficult, to move forward. Because if there's a way you can stop this bill or mess it up, there's some people that don't like the bill to begin with. It's going to be very interesting to see how all of these parties are satisfied by all of these elements, both, technical and meritorious as well as political.
Cathy, we actually have a question from a viewer that goes to that point, and it asks about, what, for example, Senator Manchin thinks about the administration's approach. And, that leads me to ask all you and all three of you, so whether you think that, it sounds like when I've heard you think there is a decent chance that the Hill and the White House will work this out. I just want see what you think about that, Cathy. But also, if they do work it out, are there any broader conclusions we can make about where trade policy stands if that happens? What I mean is, would that mean that this concept of friendshoring is gaining traction? Also on the Hill, and the idea that, we need to look out for jobs, but we also need to make sure that we have friends, who share our interests, maybe vis-a-vis China. And so that's an important part of the mix. And in the end, this is the right thing to do.
What's interesting, I would hope that Congress says, errs on the side of friends who share our interests, etc. It's really hard to predict these kind of the politics of trade can be different than kind of traditional RD. The politics of energy are always geographical more than RD, because who has wind, who has sun, who has biofuels, who has minerals has a lot to do with what they support. But I'm not so sure. I think my co-panelists could answer better on are they likely to make this a trade trend? I'll just say there's a finance committee notice for a hearing tomorrow entitled "The President's 2023 Trade Policy Agenda." I'm sure you know that, but one thing Wyden said is he has, quote, serious concerns about the approach the administration has taken to implementing the portion of the IRA that deals with critical minerals. Like, they're going to be looking at this. They absolutely are going to be, claiming their right to legislate, their right to approve, their constitutional duty to do this. And I would hope they would, put broader geopolitical issues into the mix as they consider this. But I'm not sure they will, I guess.
Right.
Is my point.
Anyone else like to comment on that? If not, there's another question from a viewer, which I think is a good follow-up. And that has to do with this idea that someone might take this to a court. And the question is, if it's found, if the administration loses the case, would that have any implications for other mini deals like the U.S.-Japan deal? And I would add to that, if friendshoring is sort of the way things are going, and if there's an appropriate way to consider national security within trade policy, are judges the right individuals to be deciding, how a country should be defining a free trade agreement if there are now, what trade policy is supposed to be is so much different from before? Kellyanne, do you want to take a stab at that? On what it might mean for other trade deals, mini deals, if a court were to find and were to overturn this, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, again, courts have been really reluctant to get into the fights between the executive and Congress over constitutional authority and sort of the interplay between the power to regulate trade between nations and the foreign affairs power of the president. So for that reason, again, I know that others in the panel may have different perspectives. Like, I'm not sure this ends up in sort of a legal battle that makes its way to the Supreme Court, and we have some big decision that, binds the U.S. government in terms of the way that trade policy is made moving forward. What I do think, though, is, and there's still skepticism to some degree on both sides of the aisle, but primarily on the Republican side, about this idea and concept of using industrial policy to sort of outcompete with China or to enhance U.S. Certain sectors that are strategic to U.S. national interests. And particularly when you're looking at things like renewable energy, there's, sort of other politics at play as well. So the extent to which this serves as a blueprint for other types of industrial policy, I think there's very much a question about. But what I will say, sort of interacting a lot with industry on this, is companies are making moves and making changes on the basis of this legislation. It is one of the first times that I have seen industries actually trying to shift and reorient on the basis of a bill like this that Congress has passed. And, the U.S. has gone historically through trends of industrial policy, and then it's out of vogue, and then it's back in vogue. And I think we're at a point when it's definitely in vogue. So, to the extent that it is a blueprint, I think this question about, what FTA partners mean and whether this is a term we want to repeat in subsequent legislation or Congress wants to amend it to mean something else, will play out. But again, I just don't see the courts really binding Congress or the executive on this issue.
I agree with Kellyanne to a large degree that there are several questions that are litigation related. So just trying to sort of cover several of them. What I think to the extent we're talking about a potential case that would be brought by, let's say, the auto industry or folks who have been harmed from the auto industry, right? What you could imagine is that someone comes in and says that Treasury is clearly not acting consistent with the text, consistently with the text of the statute, and with congressional intent, and then and you could back that up with statements from senators or members of Congress who say this is not what we meant. So to the extent Senator Manchin's saying that, that would be part of, I think, the case that one would bring, and then there are other legal theories that they of course could also bring, but that's sort of the way I would see this. One pathway that this could take to the courthouse, but that, as Kellyanne said, is could be a very narrow claim about the interpretation of this statute, right, and not a claim about mini deals generally or the congressional executive relationship on trade. It's just about how Treasury is dealing with this provision of the IRA. And so, also, as Kellyanne said before, trade deals don't often get challenged. It has sort of one or two challenges to trade deals in the past in the courts. And most of the time, the courts kick trade-related cases on political question doctrine or foreign affairs exceptions. So there are different legal theories or doctrines that are the basis for courts not entertaining some of these challenges that we've talked about today, or that might upset the entirety of the system in ways that people might otherwise expect would be possible. That's just not within the range of possibility for those reasons.
Do you think we can expect more moves like this critical minerals mini deal, for example, in the IPEF? Do you think that we're going to see the administration take pieces of it and for whatever reason want to kind of slap the term agreement on it as opposed to just something more informal? Or is this rather that there was this language from the Hill in this bill, and so the critical minerals agreement solves one particular problem, but we're not necessarily going to see a lot of imitators?
Do you mean like a more critical mineral specific FTAs being negotiated with IPEF?
No, I mean in other areas that have a kind of friend-shoring quality to them.
Yeah, I mean, administrations have been doing this for decades. I don't think there's anything new. The difference here is that it's called a free trade agreement, sort of capital F, capital T, capital A, which has a very biblical meaning to folks on the Hill, and frankly should, right? Like, this is a very interesting question. But the concept of negotiating sectoral agreements or sort of mini deals with different countries covering things that involve trade-related activities or frankly are just straight trade is nothing new. So I don't think that this sets a precedent for it. I think this is just a continuation of a trend.
Kathleen, do you agree? Okay, very good. So I think I guess one last question I would have is whether the complaints that we're hearing from the Hill, Senator Wyden called this, was concerned that about the U.S., about the administration going it alone. Is that how central is that issue? I mean, is it the going it alone part of it that is really needs to be worked out between the executive and the legislative, or is it rather the substance of the deal, who the deal is between? Which one is it that you think is really causing the most frictions here?
I'll start. I think both. At least the first two things you said, the going it alone part. That's the big picture problem that the branches have been trying to work out. The last time this was a really big deal was with the ACTA, anti-counterfeiting. People may remember that act now 15 years ago, 10 years ago. And then it came up again with Japan deal. And now here we are again. So as Kellyanne said, that this issue longstanding hasn't gone away. And so that's the going it alone big picture issue. And then the substance, as we've talked about earlier, is also going to be that's where this is going to play out in this particular question of the critical minerals deal. What does it actually say? Again, what does the U.S. get out of it? Is Congress satisfied with that? What's the political compromise that can be worked out between the branches for this specific deal? So both of those, I think, Peter, are critically important.
Right. Any last thought?
Yeah, I would just say, I agree that both issues are going to persist, but Congress always looks at bills they've passed, and how the administration implements them is always an area of concern. It's their job, it's their instinct, it's their jurisdictional kind of bent. So everything will always have that going it alone essence, for any bill. And some are just a little bit more sensitive than others.
Right. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all. This was a terrific discussion. I don't like, like my own kids, I don't like to call favorites, but one of our attendees today said it was the best panel they've ever seen. So I don't know if everyone thought that way, but at least one of our viewers was really pleased. So thank you very much. I know we are at WITA to have the 4 of you on. Very grateful to you for taking the time with us. I think we'd like to have all of you back on either this topic or other topics in the future. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks for this really scintillating trade conversation, stimulating trade conversation for those of us who live and breathe this stuff. So thank you so much for doing this. Peter, thank you for reaching out. I want to encourage other people to do that as well. When we announced this panel, Peter reached out and indicated an interest in taking part, and was really glad to have him on. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Kathleen, Cathy, and Kelly Ann for today's event, and hope to see everyone again soon, including at our event with Dr. Ngozi on April 12th. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.